Greetings, pilgrims, and welcome to another episode of the Polygon Pilgrimage. And today I'm going to share with you a guide I've been putting together for my game group for our asset general best practices. Now, this is in no way a complete list. I'm not a professor. I don't, claim that this is the perfect way to do things. This is just a list of things that I thought of from my experience working in this field and what will be most helpful to remember and to keep in mind as we work. So let's get started. So first up is regarding your UV layouts for your models. For the most part, I'd say 99% of the time, we want to make sure these are unique, which means there's no overlapping parts. Now there are some assets where it's okay for it to be completely symmetrical. In that case, then yes, we'll put UVs laying over top of one another. And then also channel 2, so your second UV channel, we always reserve that for light mapping. And then of course the all-important, make sure we're keeping in with our texel density. Alright, so next up, let's talk about the pivot location for your model. This should be a logical point to the model, usually the center bottom of an object. It depends on the object, of course, but typically if it's something like a box or a plant vase or a table, you want it to be somewhere that makes sense as to how you would move this object around your editor of choice to place it in the world. And then if it's part of a modular kit, we want to make sure that it's an easy snapping point. So typically for a wall floor combo thing, I'll put it in the bottom left hand corner vertice, so that way I can snap it together pretty easily. Alright, so next up, let's talk about clean geometry. So it's sad to have to say this, but yes, make sure your straight lines are straight. There should be, the detail on your model should be accurate to the shape, and if you have a straight edge, the corresponding edges to that edge of the object should be straight. Make sure you don't have any weird wonky vertices, unless of course you have something special going on where it's like a melting clock situation, and I guess that's okay. Make sure there's no excessive overlapping. Now, sometimes we do push the edges or the vertices of an object through like a wall or a table or some kind of floor to make sure that we don't have any light gaps. That's okay. We do that just a little bit, but make sure it's not excessive, because if you're going with an excessive amount, then you're wasting texture space. And the same can be said for no hidden faces. Let's make sure that there's not faces that we don't need, because that just increases our poly count. It's getting rendered for no reason. And again, if you happen to just unwrap everything automatically or you're not looking at it carefully, it's also taking up texture space. Alright, so next up, let's look at our animation considerations. When you're making a model that will be animated later, especially if you're not the one that's going to be animating it, make sure that you have taken into account edge loop support so that you can have proper deformations. And make sure there are no what I call exposed areas. So if your character, for example, has to open their mouth in order to talk, well, let's make sure that there are teeth in the model, that there's a tongue, that there's an interior to the mouth, and you haven't forgotten those things, and they'll be exposed when the animator goes to animate it. They're like, well, I can't do this because we're missing parts of the model. Alright, so next we're going to talk about a hero asset. And a hero asset is a general term for something that is a one-off. Like, for example, if you have a medieval village and you have this really beautiful fancy statue in the middle of the town square, and that's the only place you see that statue, well, that would be a hero asset. It's a one-time use model, and typically they have more detail because you're either going to get closer to it, it's important to the story, something like that. So let's pay close attention to its purpose and scrutiny. So we need to make sure that it has any story elements built into it, like if this statue is supposed to have been damaged in some war, let's make sure that shows up, and know that the scrutiny comes into the play when people are going to be looking at it carefully, because it is special. So you need to make sure, extra sure, that it's really, really good. Alright, next up, one of my favorites is modular kits. So if you're making a piece and it's going to be part of a modular kit, here's a couple things to consider. Make sure that it snaps together with the surrounding environment pieces quite well. Make sure that it tiles if it needs to. Let's work to make sure that we break up repetitions. This is more of a thought for the texturing behind the asset, but make sure that if you have 10 of these in a row, that it looks pretty good, and then you don't see and you can't count the repetitions. You know, you look at the details and go, da, 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 yep, I can see it repeating. Well, then we need to change some things. And little asterisks there on the reusable. Sometimes I try to make things that you can use in more than one scenario, more than one way. Like if it's going to be a pillar and it's also going to be able to be something else, let's try to tweak some things and make sure that that's available. Okay, so next let's talk about our scene location. So we need to take into account where this object will be in the scene, and we need to consider its scale versus how much detail the object is going to have. If this is a mountain in the background, it might not need much detail. Then again, it might. Depends on if you're doing like that foggy effect or if you really want to see the beautiful background. But either way, that might be a matte painting versus an actual model. And then also we need to consider, if it is closer in the scene, how much visibility will it really have? And those are some considerations you can take into if you delete some underlying faces, or how much detail it needs in the texture versus the actual geometry. So those are things that we need to consider. Next, let's talk about the silhouette of the object. This is something that is very important that a lot of people miss the mark on, so I wanted to kind of reiterate that. The silhouette is important. You need to make sure that the object is readable from a great distance. A lot of times you're playing games, a lot of like the Call of Duty, Titanfall, Battlefield type games where it's very fast and furious, right? So what we want to do is make sure that in the middle of that battle frenzy, you can immediately recognize a certain object or a certain type of character or vehicle or something. And that's going to be based upon more of its silhouette. Even though you're not going to see it in stark black and white, you're going to recognize the shapes of things before your brain sees the details in the texture. So that's an important point to say. Let's make sure that this is an iconic silhouette. And by iconic, I mean both that it sticks out in your memory and that it would be good for an icon eventually, perhaps. Something that could lend itself to all of those things. So that's a difficult thing to master. I'm not saying that, everybody does it bad, we need to do it better. No, it's that it's something that really is really important, so we need to make sure that we take those things into consideration, maybe add something or subtract something to make that happen a bit better. Okay, next let's talk about visually readable. So this is different from silhouette readable in the sense that we need to make sure that our details are believable. Now you'll notice I said believable and not realistic, because that's not always the case. We just need to make sure that when we have details, we don't put things arbitrarily. We want to make sure that if I have an object, I can put some detail to an area. Maybe I can put a label that tells you, a warning label about how the object's supposed to be used. That will make the object more believable, but it doesn't necessarily have to be realistic. Think of games like Borderlands 2. The style is not very realistic, but you can still have a detail that is believable within that universe. And then there's this idea of the 70-30 visual interest versus eye rest rule. This is sort of a general purpose rule that I found. It says that 70% of the object should be something visually interesting to look at. But then you do need about 30% eye rest. So this would be areas that are more flat and plain and purposely devoid of a lot of detail, because you need the eye to be able to rest as it's looking at an object. This goes into a lot more of the science of how we look at things, but just keep in mind that about 70-30, and then if you go about that mark, you can always tweak it either way, then you're sort of accomplishing also a longevity of how the player will be able to look at the object, and that helps a lot for retention purposes. And finally, we're down to concept art accuracy. Now, I want to make a bold statement right away. 100% accuracy is not realistic. It's not very likely to happen that you're going to take a concept and make something exactly like it. Now, I know a lot of people are throwing their hands in the air going, what are you talking about? I'm speaking on the consensus of game art at the moment. Obviously, there's lots of things in the world that we make a concept and it comes out looking exactly like it. Cars, manufactured parts, all that kind of stuff. But I'm speaking of a concept artist. Their main job is to give you a good, solid idea of what this object is going to look like in the game. And then it's our job to construct it. So when we construct it, obviously it differs wildly in your concept artist. Sometimes they make things with, nice guidelines in Photoshop and everything lines up perfectly. Okay, that's a little bit easier to model. A lot of times the concepts I get are not done that way, and that's not a bad thing. It's a different style, but they are working more with the mood and the feel of the object. And I get a good understanding of the object, but it's not physically accurate as far as the layout and graphically from a file sense. So I have to take that and I have to make some adjustments. And a lot of times it's a matter of saying, oh, this wall or this part of the object would be too thick or too thin to function. So I try to make those adjustments and take those things into consideration. So for my team specifically, I tell them we're shooting for between 85 and 90% accuracy on the concept. Now, does that mean that I completely omit objects? No. What I mean by that is the way they draw it, it's not always physically possible to build it that way. So we have to make some considerations. So that's all I mean by that. It's not that concept art in general can't be 100% accurate. It can. It takes a lot of work on both sides of the fence. And when it comes together that way, it looks beautiful. But for us, we try to reach 85 to high 90%. Probably 90, 92% is around where we usually hit. And that's fine. You know, it's not 100%, and that's okay. It still looks great. It looks like what we intended. And that's the main point, is take what you intended and make that as a thing. Not, it has to look exactly like this. So that's all I got for you guys this week. I hope that this really helps. I put this guide together for my team, but I wanted to share with you too to see if you guys could make use of this. If you have suggestions, ideas for anything pilgrimage related, or for this list, if you have things you want to add, things you want to discuss or debate, I'm up for it. Let's make it a good list so that all of our fellow artists can have this best practices kind of guide for themselves, that they can double check their work as they're working, and it will help them improve. Because ultimately that's what my heart of heart, that's what I'm after. I want to make sure that every artist gets better, and then that way art gets better, and our customer, you know, the people who enjoy our art and who relax from a long, hard day's work and they just want to play an awesome game, you know, let's give them that by making ourselves better every day. So with that, guys, I will leave you for this week. As always, keep practicing, get better, and I will see you next time as the pilgrimage continues.